Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. We're just getting things started. We're going to wait another second for people to join us. My name is James. I'm helping with the tech for today's webinar. So if for some reason you're having problems hearing me or you can't hear the presenters, just let me know, shoot me a question, and I will make sure that we can try and sort that out for you. We have several presenters today. If you have questions for them, again, you're going to be using the questions box. And I think it's 2 o'clock now, so we should hand things over to Kate. Kate, all you.
Thanks, James. Welcome, everybody. This is Kate Burdick. I am a staff attorney at Juvenile Law Center. And you'll also be hearing today from Maura McInerney, who's a senior staff attorney at Education Law Center of Pennsylvania, as well as two other panelists who I'll introduce in short order. But we just are really pleased that you are taking the time to join us today. I'm going to start by just telling you first what the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education is. That's the organization that is hosting this webinar. So it's actually a collaboration of Southern Poverty Law Center, Juvenile Law Center, Education Law Center of Pennsylvania, and the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law. And our mission is to ensure that all young people who are in or returning from the juvenile or criminal justice systems can access a quality education. And we've done that through a variety of ways. We have worked very hard to implement the federal Every Student Succeeds Act, the juvenile justice provisions of that act that was passed in December of 2015. We've published the Blueprint for Change, this online interactive toolkit that you are going to hear plenty about today. And we've had two different convenings with national experts from around the country, one in 2016 that was focused actually a lot on developing the Blueprint tool, and one in 2017 focused on juvenile justice and education litigation. And one of the things that we're hoping to gain from today's webinar is to hear from you about what you think are the barriers to success for young people involved in the juvenile justice system, examples of promising practices and policies, and what you think the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education should focus on in our coming work. And I will also mention that the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education is built on the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, a long-standing collaboration of the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law with Juvenile Law Center and Education Law Center. And you can find out more about that legal center at fostercareandeducation.org. As a background, the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education actually hosted a webinar on the Blueprint for Change back in December. And that was before the Blueprint was an online tool, but my colleagues here went through the Blueprint structure, what the goals are, and I highly encourage you to listen to that recording to get more information about the Blueprint if you weren't part of it. We are not going to rehash all of that today because that's available for you there. Another thing that Blueprint covered that we're not going to get into, or rather that webinar covered that we're not going to get into today, is the background to why we think it is so critically important to focus on improving access to quality education for young people in the juvenile justice system. That webinar really delves into what all of the struggles are, more statistics and background. So if that is new to you, that would be another reason to check out that webinar online. Another thing that I want to mention is that you should feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box. I'm going to pull up a poll in just a second to figure out, for our purposes, generally who is on the line, but we would love to hear more in the chat box about who you are, where you're coming from, what your role is. Also, if you have questions either about the Blueprint itself, about the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education, or about the two examples that we're going to highlight today, please do put those into the question box, and our goal is to get to those in the last 10 or so minutes of the webinar today. So I'm going to, before we get into the agenda, I'm going to launch a poll here. Can you guys see the poll? Is that coming up? Okay, yes. So please fill in what your role is, and if you are checking other, I would appreciate it if you would go ahead and throw into the chat box what your role is. We were sort of limited in the amount of options we could put into the poll. So I'm going to give you just a couple more seconds. All right, I'm about to close the poll, last chance. All right. So I'm just sharing that. So we have, unfortunately, no judges on the line, but we do have several educators, folks working within juvenile justice, and many policy advocates, and then some other folks. So I look forward to hearing that. It's a good smattering today. Okay, so we're going to give you a little background to what the structure of the blueprint is. In just a second, I'm going to turn it over to Maura for that. And Maura will then turn it back to me. I'm going to pull up the online tool itself, jjeducationblueprint.org. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I just want to take a few minutes to highlight some of the features on it, because that is the online tool that we hope you will be regularly using after today. And then we're going to focus in on two of the examples that we highlight in the blueprint. The blueprint has, I think, hundreds of examples, and we've chosen two really interesting policy examples today. Amy Woolard from the Legal Aid Justice Center is going to talk about re-enrollment regulations that they've been successful in putting into place in Virginia. And Nilsen Blumenson, who's Executive Director of the School Justice Project, is going to talk about an interagency transition planning MOA that they have in Washington, D.C. So the discussion from Amy and Claire will make up the bulk of the webinar, because we think that what we really want to convey is that the blueprint houses a lot of rich information that we hope others will replicate and will spark ideas for making change throughout the country. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maura.
Thanks so much, Kate. I wanted to mention that the previous webinar also featured a lot of information regarding the Every Student Succeeds Act and the specific provisions that address improving educational outcomes for youth in the juvenile justice system, with some examples of advocacy tips around those issues. So if your jurisdiction, your state is still working on that state plan, that might be a resource for you. I just wanted to provide a short overview of the blueprint. It is, as Kate mentioned, it presents 10 goals that set forth the broad framework for promoting educational success for youth involved in the juvenile justice system, and also provides correlating benchmarks for each one of the 10 goals that, if achieved, would indicate progress towards improving educational outcomes. In addition, it highlights specific examples of policies, model laws, juvenile court rules, programs, practices that could improve educational outcomes for youth in the juvenile justice system. And we think it's a really rich resource. We were very, very fortunate to have consulted many experts to identify what those goals and priorities would be, and to help us in the development of benchmarks, and also to provide us with some model programs and laws, etc. We really, really welcome all of you on this call to tell us about things you know that are going on in your jurisdiction, that have been model programs or laws or things that you're working on. We'd really love to hear more about it. The blueprint was modeled, as Kate mentioned, after the Blueprint for Change Educational Success for Children in the Foster Care System that's available at the fostercareandeducation.org website. Now, that Blueprint for Change has been utilized and adopted by several states as a framework for reform to improve educational outcomes. For example, Florida, Iowa, Nebraska, Texas, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., and West Virginia all adopted that Blueprint for Change as a framework to try to improve and reform, to bring about systemic change in those jurisdictions. So we would really encourage folks to think about utilizing the Blueprint for Change in the same way, and also to use it for direct advocacy. To be aware of laws that are mentioned there, as well as a lot of rich national resources that can be utilized in terms of direct case advocacy. Now I'd like to just give the overview of what the 10 goals are. You'll see on this slide we talk about goal 1 being ensuring that we have youth voice, 2, adult support, 3, ensuring that students are educated in the community, 4, that there are full opportunities for youth in the juvenile justice system to participate in education in the community. We look at, under Goal 5, the quality education is provided in juvenile justice placements. We look at whether those placements in Goal 6 are supported school environments for youth. Number 7, we look at career pathways. 8 is post-secondary access. 9 is looking at smooth transitions, both when a student goes to a juvenile justice placement and upon return from such a placement. And then 10 looks at specific cohorts of very vulnerable youth, and including intersections between students with disability, et cetera, and looks at what are the particular protections we could put into place. We just want to mention, as we're looking at this overview, that our goal here is not to make juvenile justice placements better. It's to recognize that we want to ensure that there are protections in place for students who are in juvenile justice placements, but also looking at youth who stay in communities, and in what ways does touching the juvenile justice system undermine their educational success. We know that it does make a difference, as even if they stay in a school community. So what can we do to better support them to remain in community and to have access to the full range of educational opportunities and resources they need? So I just wanted to highlight a few of the goals before we go into the two models that we're going to focus on today. So if you look at Goal 1, Youth Voice, you'll see that in the blueprint we talk about youth leadership forums that are in 30 states that empower students with disabilities to be self-advocates. We also look at examples such as the Principal Centers Collaborative in San Francisco, which is a high school of choice for students on probation with demonstrated academic, behavioral, and mental health issues. We also look at the Juvenile Justice Youth Leadership Council that is in Louisiana that empowers young people to develop skills and use their collective voice to address systemic issues with stakeholders and advocate for policy reforms. You'll see we also highlight Juveniles for Justice here at the Juvenile Law Center as well. And then under Goal 2, we talk about model juvenile court rules adopted in Pennsylvania and California. We look at the youth justice mentoring programs that are in several jurisdictions, including in San Francisco. And we also highlight the School Justice Project in Washington, D.C. that provides individual representation in the special education context for court-involved students with disabilities. Under Goal 3, we look at being educated in the community, specific recommendations that were made by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges in their 2012 Technical Assistance Brief. We look at detention alternatives, such as in Chicago, that utilizes community-based programming and community-based reporting centers to allow youth to remain in their homes and to attend their community schools instead of being removed from their homes. Goal 4 looks at full opportunities in the community and a lot of examples in that context. And then in Goal 5, we look at what do we need to do to ensure a quality education in juvenile justice placements. There's comprehensive data about protecting the civil rights of students in juvenile justice system from the Office of Civil Rights, as well as the Youth with Special Education Needs and Justice Settings fact sheet from NDTAC, which provides some, highlights some existing programs that improve educational outcomes specifically for youth with disabilities in the juvenile justice system. As we know, it's estimated that there are between 30 to 80% of incarcerated youth with a disability, compared with 13% in traditional public schools. And then in Goal 6, we look at what do we need to do to ensure supportive school environments, and it highlights what trauma-informed care models look like, as well as positive behavioral support interventions in schools, including juvenile justice placements. Goal 7 looks at career paths, career education for youth and juvenile justice programs, some local school districts in Florida who are looking at state-run juvenile justice facilities located in counties and ensuring that all students in the juvenile justice system have access to career and professional education, or CAPE courses, and related services to support transition goals and reentry. Under Goal 8, we look at post-secondary access, and you'll see we highlight College Not Prison as one of those examples, which is a project aimed to make college more accessible and affordable for justice-involved youth. Also a program in Ohio in the Buckeye United School District that serves youth detained in secure juvenile correction facilities in Ohio, but is partnered with a private institution, Ashland University, to offer some online college courses to detained youth. And then juvenile justice facilities that's to support career training and educational programming in Florida, where they partnered with the Department of Education to make available Perkins grants for juvenile justice facilities to allow the development of non-traditional career exploration programs. So we look at all of those. Goal 9, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because the two models that we're highlighting today really go in depth on some of those models that we wanted to highlight. And then goal 10, you'll see talks about protecting vulnerable youth and specific cohorts of children, including youth of color, youth with disabilities, LGBTQ youth, gender nonconforming and transgender youth, and English language learners who are involved, and it also highlights what needs to be done for children who are both duly adjudicated in both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and looking at all of the intersectional identities. So we think that this is a really rich resource, and now I'm going to turn it over to Kate to sort of walk you through how to utilize this resource online.
Okay, so I'm going to pull up the actual website, and I'm really excited that we have this website because I think the benefit of having this online is that it can be constantly updated. And again, I'm going to make a plea to you all if you see that something you've been working on or you know is happening in your jurisdiction is not included. We have our contact information at the end of this presentation. I really would ask you to send that to me. Same thing if you see an error or something else that needs changing within the blueprint, or you have suggestions for the framework in general, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are very grateful to Southern Poverty Law Center for funding the creation of this website from the materials that we have been gathering with the different experts. And hopefully this website you will find to be pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time showing you how to navigate it, but I want to just hit a few key points here. So on the home page, we're going to have a few different ways that you can see what the goals are and how to browse the rich information that Maura previewed for you. But I just want to say if you scroll down, you can get more information on how one might actually use the blueprint and what the context is, which are pretty important to understanding what the blueprint is. And again, we've covered that, so I'm not going to get into it now, but it's there for your reference. Similarly, if you want to know more about the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education, or our partners, the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, you can see here a link to the Blueprint for Change on the foster care side. That's all under the About page. Now I'm going to go back to the home page and show you how you can navigate here. So you can browse by goal. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to click on goal 5 here. In the picture, I could have also chosen to click on the side where it says browse by goal. And you have what the goal is, the full text, as well as the benchmarks that Maura mentioned. So each goal has several benchmarks for stakeholders using the blueprint to figure out how to measure their success and how to really implement what the overarching goal is trying to achieve. As you scroll down, that's when you get into the meat, the resources, policies, and practices that we've compiled that we think appear to support each goal. So, for example, here we have several resources that can be anything from publications, webinars, other types of information studies. Then you're going to find policies, and that we've included things like the Dear Colleague letters that have come out recently from the federal government, as well as policies in specific jurisdictions, like you can see here in Arizona statute. And then at the bottom, you're going to find practices, which tend to be more like organizations or existing, actually working practices from around the country. And if you click on any one of these, you're going to get more information. So as an example, I wanted to highlight one of the ND Tech resources here on special education. Let's see if I can find the one I was going to click on. If not, any of these will do. So I'm just going to click on one because I don't think you want to waste your time going through this with me. Sorry about that. Oh, I found it. Okay. So, for example, NDTAC, the National Evaluation and Technical Assistance Center for the Education of Children and Youth who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk, which is a great organization. We have a lot of their resources on this site. They have this fact sheet on special education needs. I'm just highlighting this to show you that when you click on these within the blueprint, you get a summary. You can click go to the source, which will actually take you right to the source. If my internet were a little faster, we'd get there faster. There you go. And you can also see more information below. So in this case, NDTAC actually hosted a webinar on this resource, so that appears below. There's not always that for every single one, but that's there. All right, really quickly, I'm just going to show you that you can also look at general resources and policies. Those are resources that are so broad that they didn't necessarily fit into just one goal or a few of the goals. They're really overarching. For example, some laws are within general resources. You can learn more about the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example. You can also browse by state, either by going home and browsing by state or looking at the states on the top here. And I'm going to show you today, we're going to talk to Amy from Virginia. So her example you can find either by going into Goal 9 where it's highlighted or by clicking on Virginia. And then here is the write-up for that particular goal. And the reason we've asked Amy and then Claire to speak today is, again, we really want you to understand that the write-ups within the blueprint can lead you to these sources where there is just so much great information happening. There's a lot. I don't know what that was or if anybody heard that little blip, but hopefully you can still hear me. There's just a lot of great work going around the country, so we wanted to highlight what the blueprint can do for you. So with that, I'm actually going to change it over to Amy, who is going to talk more about Virginia. All right, Amy, on to you.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me do a quick sound check if you can hear me okay.
Sounds great.
Okay, great. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Woolard. I am an attorney and policy coordinator for the Legal Aid Justice Center in Virginia. And specifically, I work a lot with our JustChildren program, which is kind of a statewide children's law program in Virginia. We represent individual clients on the legal aid side. So a lot of young people in some of the situations that I'll talk about today. But we also have a strong organizing component and a strong impact and policy work component, and that's mainly where my role resides. And I just want to quickly thank LCYJE for the opportunity to share with you all today. I'm going to go through just some brief slides about our re-enrollment regulations in Virginia, and then I think that they stand on their own, but I think that they also are, there's always room for improvement, and they can at least serve as a foundation to build on.
And Amy, I'm not sure if you haven't shared your screen yet. I think you might have to click accept there.
Oh, I thought that I did. I'm sorry.
Let me try. All right. Well, I have not just keep going and
Amy,
it out on our end.
Okay.
Amy, if you click the little triangular button at the top that says show screen, you can show it yourself.
Okay. I'm not seeing that, and I don't want to delay folks. Is it okay if I just have you do it, Kate?
Yep, no problem.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go to slide 1. It says re-enrollment regulations at the top. Okay. So our regulations for re-enrollment cover students who are in the custody of the Department of Juvenile Justice. So these are students in our juvenile correctional centers or in detention centers if they are in there longer than 30 days. The regs establish components of the re-enrollment plan's content, and they also establish a timeline of the re-enrollment process and set parameters around which agencies are responsible for which portions of the process. So the regs themselves, if you click through from the blueprint, you can see are pretty minimal. They were actually developed in the early 2000s and went into effect back in 2006. And as with most states, probably our agencies often have a lot of trouble, both because of structural and tech barriers and because of ingrained practice with talking to each other to coordinate. We were a very, very siloed state, and that's gotten better, especially over the last decade, but it's still a big challenge. And just to provide a little bit of background of our juvenile justice situation here, until last year, we had one of the longest, if not the longest, length of stay averages in the country for kids incarcerated in our juvenile prisons. Our kids were staying in our juvenile correctional centers an average of 15 to 18 months as of just a year and a half ago. And at that time, I think the national average was around 9 months. And then, of course, the number that's often mentioned in best practice is that no more than 6 month figure as the point of diminishing return. So we were, double and maybe triple, depending on how you look at it, keeping kids in incarceration. And similarly, as with nationally, our population is still shrinking. So just as kind of a baseline, I think of as a month ago or so, while we certainly have youth in and out of detention centers, our juvenile correctional center population was around 220 youth, and our average daily population in our detention centers is about 640 youth. And so by comparison, back in 2006 when these regs went into effect, ADP for our juvenile prisons was about 1,000 youth, and ADP for the detention centers was about 1,450 youth. And so in the last slide I'll talk about, and throughout I'll kind of share some lessons learned. As I said, I think these are still a good foundation for basing these kinds of regulations off of if you're thinking about doing that in your state. And I appreciate all the references to the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, because I think there are also a lot of similarities. And we even gained some lessons learned from our own process in thinking through how to implement some of the foster care education transition work. So I'll move on to the next slide. The Re-Enrollment Team, as laid out in the regulations, talks about kind of this minimal team. And again, I'm going to keep referring back to this going into effect in the early 2000s, because it was kind of a foundational period of time for thinking through some of this team-based work. And so I think, I will probably highlight some lessons learned as we go through. The Re-Enrollment Team that thinks through the whole transition process for our young people, at a minimum, includes a guidance counselor. As probably in most states, many of our young people have special education needs, and so that team member, if appropriate, a principal or assistant principal, a re-enrollment coordinator, and I know we see parallels of this in the McKinney-Vento arena and the foster care arena of kind of this liaison type role, and I think that our state, probably like a lot of states, in applying things like ESSA and thinking through, who that person should be, that has kind of been in flux a little bit, but there should be a re-enrollment coordinator on the team as well as a probation officer. In our regs themselves, it talks about parents and guardians and school social workers and school psychologists are to be invited. I think I sort of flagged it with an asterisk because, we see in other contexts where parents, especially, of course, are kind of a mandated participant. We do have in our regulations that the student needs to be involved, but that I just sort of flagged as something you might want to think about as, a mandated member of that team. And I think, the team itself is reflective of what was going on at the time, what we were seeing from a lot of clients, in that kids coming out of the correctional centers were going through, kind of another punitive process in a way when they were entering back into school. They were going through disciplinary paneling. They were, just kind of falling through the cracks. There was no real communication, much less coordination between schools and the Department of Juvenile Justice or probation. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next slide, timeline. A lot of the timing in and of itself, and I'll go through these a little bit, was sorting, whose job is what, which agency was responsible for the process. And it was one of the biggest motivating factors behind our push for the regs. And as you can imagine, students coming out of incarceration were just not a priority for a lot of folks. Records were never transferred. Many students fell into kind of an educational limbo, either not enrolled at all or placed in completely inappropriate situations that just facilitated them back into that spiral of school failure and school dropout. And so you can kind of see we're on a 30-day track. The re-enrollment process begins 30 calendar days before the student's release. Within 5 days of the notification of that, the locality and parents' guardians also receive notice and information about the process. Records go to the enrolling school division 25 days before release, and the re-enrollment team meets within 10 days of receipt of the records and the development of the preliminary plan, and the meeting notice goes at least a week beforehand. Again, the student should be involved in the development of the plan as per the reg itself, and the plan needs to ensure that the student is enrolled and receiving instruction within 2 school days of release. And I want to flag that a little bit too, just to say, that's even kind of a broader timeline than we have for some of our other students in foster care and under McKinney-Vento. And I want to encourage everyone that it's important to kind of push people beyond what they think they can do here. When we were kind of negotiating these regs, there were folks who, you can imagine, pushed back on some of the tighter time frames. And I just really want to urge people to encourage agency folks that they can do this in quicker time frames than they might think if they haven't been already. I'm going to move to slide 4. I'm not going to go through all of these, in the essence of time and the notion that I know you all can read for yourselves, but this is kind of the regulatory layout of what our re-enrollment plan should be for kids, the components that it needs to have. And I can't say in Virginia that all of this happens in every plan, but getting these components into the regs at least gives attorneys, advocates, parents, etc., a foundation to point to if and when the criteria aren't met, which ends up being kind of a form of training in and of itself. Getting people to use the regs is as much the battle as getting them in place in the first place. And so, as I'll mention in my next slide, turnover of employees, of probation officers, of re-enrollment coordinators, of all the folks that are part of this process, that kind of turnover means that, the regs need to be a living set of documents. Like, we need to keep training folks and make sure that employees are getting trained on them regularly. And so I'll just wrap up with my last slide, lessons learned. As I mentioned, these regs were developed in the early 2000s. They went into effect in 2006. The country was just beginning at that point to kind of slowly, in glacial time, emerge from, a harsher juvenile justice era. We didn't get everything we wanted when we started, but looking at them, these regs were developed actually when I was a law student, and now, 10, 15 years later, as a practicing attorney, I'm still having to make sure that they're put into effect and implemented properly. The cases that we were getting, these were kids who were just falling through the cracks. You all see them all the time. One thing I will flag too in lessons learned, the regs themselves don't apply to kids who are in detention for fewer than 30 days. That was just something that we, at that point, did not win a battle on. So it's not necessarily something that I would recommend, but it might be a point for advocacy to try to get those kids covered too. And as well, the devil is really in the implementation details, as we've been saying all along. Ensuring that the teams are convening, that parents are participating, and that timelines are met requires vigilance and requires resources sometimes that don't exist for all kids. Turnover, again, is a big part of this. So, you know, these regs have been in effect for 11 years now, and we're continuing to look for ways to make sure that they are reinforced in their implementation. And then I want to end, you know, on a positive note. This whole experience of putting these regs in place really helped pave the way for a similar and I think more effective process to be developed in Virginia for youth in foster care. That we had a process of convening 2 agencies and advocates and local folks together to put, you know, these regs into place, that we had already gone through all of that, I think made it a lot smoother and more effective when we came together around the Fostering Connections requirements to set the stage for that process in foster care. And I think that is about all that I have. I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point in the webinar, but I will turn it back over to Kate and leave it there.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thanks for bearing with us with the slide change there. And just so everybody knows, please feel free to write questions into the chat box, and we will, after Claire speaks, try to get to them. Also, if you have any sort of barriers or other things you want Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education to address, you can feel free to throw that in the chat box as well. And to answer some questions that have come in, we are recording this webinar, and we are going to send it out with the slides and everyone's contact information, and hopefully also a PDF that has just the blueprint goals and benchmarks in it after this webinar. Not immediately after, but shortly thereafter. So thank you so much, Amy. And I'm going to pull it back up just quickly here. We're going to show you that Claire is next. And Claire is the Executive Director and co-founder of the School Justice Project, which Maura actually mentioned earlier is one of the examples of practices we have included under Goal 2. But Claire is going to mostly be highlighting the Memorandum of Agreement that she helped bring about in Washington, D.C. on interagency transition planning. So thank you so much, Amy, and now on to Claire. Claire,
hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see the screen? Okay, great.
I can hear you. Can we see your screen is the question. You can click the button at the top there that says show screen.
I did. Is it showing up?
It's not showing up at the moment.
Well, I can pull up your slides and we can do that. Just like we did for Amy. That's why we did this. All right. So I have your slides up. And hopefully you can see my screen if not. James, can everybody see my screen still?
No, Kate, because I think you changed the presenter, so I just changed it back to you. So now you should be able to show your screen.
All right.
Now we can see it.
Okay, so I guess, can you click off the cover page to the interagency gaps?
You got it.
Great. So hi, everyone. I'm Claire Blumenson. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of School Justice Project, or SJP. So SJP is a special education legal services nonprofit in DC, and we're dedicated to older court-involved students with disabilities. So we work with students ages 17 to 22 who are involved in either the juvenile or criminal system and have special education needs. And we represent them through a direct representation program for any education issues that they have, and also partner with defense attorneys to seek alternatives to incarceration. And then we also have a systemic advocacy program and then a legal training program as well, where we train attorneys and court professionals on integrating special education law into the juvenile and criminal context. So, just as background, we're sort of coming from this perspective of looking at older students, so, adult students with special education needs, and those who are involved in the court system. So just to give you a sense of numbers and percentages, so, about 50% of students who are committed to DYRS are in that client pool, which can be surprising because it's the juvenile justice system, but there are, the vast majority are 17 to 22. And then 80% of DYRS committed youth have special education needs, which is, grossly disproportionate to the general student population. So we see the value of using special education law to improve education access all around. So for students with special education needs and students without. So, Amy covered a lot of the common issues that we were seeing with our clients, but we came at this representing individual student and then the next individual student, and we kept seeing the same common issues, right? We saw students who were placed in facilities where their IEPs couldn't be implemented. We saw students who would get placed in facilities all across the country. DC places students in facilities in Iowa, Utah, everywhere. And they would come home and find out that their credits didn't count. Or while they were there, they would be placed in the same courses over and over. We would have students taking, environmental science multiple times, taking Algebra 2, but never taking Algebra 1. And so, we kept seeing these same sort of systemic barriers. And then when students would come home, their transition was really anything but smooth, right? They would come home and they would have real difficulty re-entering the community because schools would either refuse to enroll them, or there just frankly wouldn't be options for older court-involved students, right? So they'd come home and at age 20 or age 19, and if their credits didn't count, they'd either have to go back to 9th grade with 14-year-olds or go to a school where they'd reduce their special education hours in order to be educated with their same age peers. So there were all sorts of issues that, we started to realize had to do with the agencies rather than, specific individual students. And so even though in our individual cases we could tackle these things, we would continue to see the same issues unless there was some kind of broader fix. Can you go to the next slide? So one of the key things that an interagency agreement can do is really highlight the gaps where there may be questions of agency responsibility. So who is the local education agency was a very big issue in DC. So who should be responsible when a kid gets committed to DYRS and placed in a DYRS facility? Secondly, an interagency agreement can really map out the big issues of process and procedure. So how many days, how many days should an agency have before alerting the home agency that the student's coming back? And so both things are equally important, although for DC, really delineating responsibility was sort of the primary factor. So in DC, a big problem was that once students were committed to DYRS, no agency had, it was not clear which agency had responsibility. And so that meant for the databases that it was, whether DC Public Schools should keep records of the student or whether the Juvenile Justice Agency should keep the education records became a big issue. And so often no records were kept of students once they got committed to the Juvenile Justice Agency. Other things that an interagency agreement can help with, sort of the minutia, right? Has the facility received records from the last placement? Are there differences between what students had in the last placement and what they have in the current placement? Are their courses and credits aligned, not just to what the student needs, but also to what the home school will accept? So for example, if a student is placed in facilities that offer math calculations, but that's not something that DC will accept as a math requirement, then there's really no point in having that student take that math class. But these are things that, it's not that the Juvenile Justice Agency is doing something wrong or the Education Agency is doing something wrong. It's just that they need to be communicating. And so interagency agreements are really good in the sense that they can hammer out a lot of these details. Next slide. So DC in 2012, amid all of these questions of who is responsible, entered into a memorandum of agreement. And this was with OSSI, which is the state education agency, DYRS, which is the Juvenile Justice Agency, and DCPS. And so the memorandum of agreement basically, one, delineates responsibility for what agency is responsible and divides it by placement. So unlike, some states, the Juvenile Justice Agency acts as the local education agency. It's the public agency responsible for providing a FAPE for students who are placed at DC's long-term secure facility. Now, that only houses around 60 students. So anyone else who's committed to DYRS and placed in secure facilities goes to out-of-state, either residential treatment facilities, psychiatric residential treatment facilities, or out-of-state group homes. And so for those students, there's a different local education agencies, so that stays with DCPS. And then there's the period of time, this is like what Amy was saying with the under 30 days, there's a period of time where students are in awaiting placement status. And so during that time, the MOA now, it's been revised since 2012, the MOA now address who's responsible for DYRS committed youth who are in awaiting placement status. And so, in a lot of ways, I think this was the most critical piece, because until then, for example, if a student with special education needs wanted to file a complaint because he wasn't receiving services, there was no agency to file the complaint with. Despite having, federal special education rights, if there's no one to file a complaint, no one to say, like, this agency didn't provide me the services, then it's impossible to enforce their rights. So just the pure delineation of responsibility was a really key factor. And then secondly, the actual content. So the MOA is about 15 pages long, and it goes through in really good detail, what each agency who's involved, so the Juvenile Justice Agency, the Education Agency, what they need to do at each stage of the process, depending on facility. And that includes students who are coming to the facilities, students who are, in the facilities, students who are coming home from the facilities. And then there are some sort of catch-all provisions that address key issues. Next slide, please. So I already went through this, so we can keep going. Are you on a closer look? I can only see my screen.
Sorry, now we're on a closer look.
Okay, cool. So this is just an example of how some of the detail. So for students who are at New Beginnings, which is the local DC facility, it first goes through and says who's responsible. So DYRS is the public agency responsible for ensuring a free and appropriate public education. But then it goes into more detail than it has here. But it does talk about, at what level the different agencies get involved, what happens if the students have an IEP or if they don't, and who should be at various meetings. And then it does the same thing. So again, it's split up by agency responsibility, which is divided by student placement. And so this is, I think that this is a helpful way for the organization of interagency agreements to be split, because as a advocate, you can, if you have a client who's at New Beginnings, there's a section of the MOA that applies, and the students who are at New Beginnings can look to that section to know what sort of they're entitled to, and then the attorneys can look to that section. The teachers and administrators, they know sort of what section they're in based on what facility. And then it's another benefit to how the MOA is laid out is that it does separate students with IEPs and students without IEPs. And this is something that was really valuable for the interagency agreement. The complaint that this resulted from really was just about special education. And because DC didn't have really anything on what should happen for education for students involved in the court systems. Because there was this special education legal hook, all of a sudden the agencies really took the extra step to talk about students without IEP. So by including both of them in the Memorandum of Agreement, it provides a tool for not just students with special education needs, but all students and all education provision. So that's been a really good tool for students, for educators, administrators, legal professionals, et cetera. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. I mean, a lot of it, I think, is very similar to what Amy said. So having an interagency agreement has definitely changed a lot. And it's been, I think on the positive side, it's definitely increased channels of communication. The agencies are coming together. They're recognizing areas where there were sort of hidden, like these fissures that students were falling into. And I think before it was just harder to see because the agencies, everyone was sort of operating in silos. So it has made a huge difference clarifying roles and responsibilities, and is a powerful tool because of that. It's also a valuable tool for defense attorneys because sometimes students will violate, their community placement. But if it turns out that, when you look at the Memorandum of Agreement, there were all these things that were supposed to be set in place that never actually happened, it can be really helpful for the defense attorney to raise these to the committee so that their probation doesn't get revoked. And then there are more eyes on sort of what's happening with implementation. It can also be a really helpful tool for students because it's very explicit on what's supposed to be happening and when. And I think that's really valuable, especially when so much is, really opaque. So I think overall, it's a good systemic remedy for these big issues that you can't really handle with, addressing individual client-specific issues. But there are definitely still implementation issues, compliance issues, and then a question about reauthorization. So for implementation, once an interagency agreement's put in place, you're obviously going to have this lag time where there has to be training, there has to be knowledge on the ground level. So students, probation officers, or social workers need to know about it. Their teachers and special ed coordinators and school administrators need to know about it. And then they need to really be trained on exactly what the different things that they're supposed to be implementing are. And then students and parents and families and attorneys also need to be trained on it. And then this can also be an issue with third-party contractors. So even if everyone on the ground in the agencies understands the MOA and feels confident with implementation, if they're not actually the ones who are doing the implementation, but they're contracting out, then you're going to run into the same thing with implementation in the end. Additionally, for compliance, one of the stated activities of the MOA is that it talks about oversight and monitoring of both education service delivery and compliance with federal and local special education law. We found that this is a little bit less effective just because it's still something that's so nebulous. So having state oversight, if just having a sentence in there saying like that the state education agency is responsible for monitoring, I think something has to be spelled out a little bit more about what that looks like in order for compliance really to happen. And additionally, it seems that there will always be these issues. We don't have regulations or something else where there's this permanent education agreement in place. We don't have law on it, right? And so what happens if this agreement expires or isn't reauthorized in time? And that has happened in the past where it says it will expire unless reauthorized. And then if it's not reauthorized, who is the agency that's responsible, and who do we bring to a due process hearing if we need to do that, and who do students look to for accountability purposes? And so with a law, you wouldn't have those same things, but the problem is, once you have an interagency agreement in place, if you think that that means you don't need a law in place as well, then you can sort of run into these issues of sort of a more squishy area where you could be back to back to the starting point again. So I guess in closing, this has definitely been a positive step forward for DC. And I think the agencies have really done great work coming together and sort of working on these issues together, getting feedback, being responsive to additional state complaints, and really, working very hard to come up with this robust agreement. I do think that improvements could be made by having something permanent and using some kind of interagency agreement to sort of bolster and strengthen a law would be a more effective way to go. The other thing is you definitely don't need state complaints or any kind of litigation to put these things into place. And I think DC's done a really good job of going above and beyond to try to make sure that the key issues are addressed. So I would definitely recommend other states working on this, just making sure that they also have local laws in place that do very similar work as well.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm putting up Claire's contact information now. Claire and Amy, thank you both so much. And this is Kate again. To recap, the reason that we wanted to spotlight the Virginia and Washington, D.C. models here was because we have, through the blueprint, this overarching system of 10 goals with corresponding benchmarks, Goal 9 being about smooth transitions educationally to and from juvenile justice facilities. And within all of that, all of the goals, but including Goal 9, there are just so many different ways that one could theoretically try to make a difference on that in their jurisdiction. And so DC has tackled it through this way that Claire has mentioned, Virginia has tackled it through a different way that Amy talked about, and there are within the blueprint tons of other ways and resources to support thinking about this. And that's what our goal is of having the blueprint online and creating the framework is so that you have the tools you need to either support the stakeholders or be yourself the one driving the change to implement a policy practice that will address educational success for juvenile justice involved youth. And so I see one question that's come in. Let me put it back to the other PowerPoint. So we have our very beautiful, oops, sorry about that, questions picture here. So I have one question. Do any of you have outcome data on the number of days it takes a youth to enroll in school and how long they stay in school? Claire or Amy, do you have any of that data?
I would love some.
I think it's a great question, and it's something, as I said, these are older regs that were put into place, and so I think that there were a lot of lessons learned. I don't have specific data. I think probably in Virginia, like most states, sometimes we run into that kind of locality versus state issue when it comes to getting really good data from the local school divisions. But it is something that we are working towards in the foster care context in implementing the Fostering Connections Act in terms of enrolling young people when they change placements. And I'm hopeful that perhaps that process we can actually kind of learn from ourselves and go back into the juvenile justice context and try to find out some of that information. I don't know, even in the foster care context, about kind of like how the ongoing stability part, but we're looking at collecting data around meeting all of the timelines, meeting the records timelines, and zeroing in on the quickest time frame, which is, in the re-enrollment juvenile justice context, is that, within 2 days, kid is in school, student is in school and participating. And in the foster care context, we actually shortened it to basically 1 day. That we're really interested to know if localities are hitting that target. So as we progress with trying to get that data, I'm certainly happy to share it with the Legal Center and keep people posted in whatever context is helpful. I wish I had better info.
And we have the issue of this sort of data gap for 18 to 22-year-olds where, the Juvenile Justice Agency will collect information on like 30 days, 60 days, 90 days for enrollment, but they're often not collecting it for 18 and older. And then the criminal system isn't collecting special education information, and then the education systems are often not collecting information for students who are incarcerated or who have a different local education agency because they're committed to the juvenile justice system. So that we definitely have this data gap for the 18 to 22-year-olds where even if there is information that's being collected on the younger students, it's not being collected on sort of our focus population. Yeah. And one of it. The other issue is finding schools where older students can enroll. So with their special education needs being met, and so often our clients, not our clients, but our client pool will be marked as dropout because they'll be counseled into GED because they're 20 years old and only have 6 credits, and so again that'll be an issue for data collection.
Great, thank you. And I wish we had time for more questions today, but we've reached the end of our time. I just want to mention that, and again, this will be in the follow-up email, but you can reach the entire Legal Center at LCYJE Blueprint at ejcenter.org. And if you are interested, we have a National Juvenile Justice and Education listserv that we operate. If you want to join that, there are a variety of different stakeholders, and I put out information about different webinars and policies and practices that I hear about, publications that come out, but we really want it to be more of an interactive forum that all people are using to get information and to make change in their jurisdiction. So just shoot an email to either me directly or this general email if you want to join that, and I'll send you the registration information. If you know of policies, practices, or resources that we don't have in the blueprint and you think we should, please also send them along to that address. And similarly, if there are barriers that you're seeing in your work, working with young people that continue to plague you and you think that the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education should focus on, please feel free to send those. We're really doing some strategic planning about what is going to be our future focus, and we would love to hear from you about what is most pressing. Again, you can find the website for the Legal Center and the blueprint at jjeducationblueprint.org. You can reach Maura or me, Kate Burdick, at the contact information on the screen now, and we'll send a follow-up email with more of that. You're also, when you plug out of this webinar, you're going to get a survey with just 3 quick questions about whether this or the blueprint seems useful to you and what you're currently seeing as challenges to education success for juvenile justice-involved youth. We'd really appreciate your filling that out so that we can adjust our work accordingly and make sure that we're doing things that will actually help the field. So feel free to be in touch, and we'll go ahead and sign off. Thank you so much, especially to our presenters, Claire and Amy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.